Okay, so part two of the World War II lecture focuses in on how specifically the United States entered in to World War II. And in part one, we talked about kind of American foreign policy in the 20s and the early 30s, and also um, how the war started in general. That's where we left off with the German invasion of Poland in 1939. So we're looking at now the what immediately preceded American entry into World War II, and then kind of how the United States reacted shortly thereafter. And so FDR, it was clear by the later half of the 1930s that the United States was seeing what was going on. I mean, you already had some problems with Japan. You already had a dictator in Italy. Hitler was in power in Germany by the early 1930s, so it was clear there were things going on, and the United States was cognizant of what those things were. And so the Neutrality Acts of 1935 and 1937 on the surface looked like the United States was continuing the old neutral policies of staying outside of these European wars. And what it did was it prohibited American dollars from going to what we termed as belligerents. In the end, those belligerents are going to be more like people like Germany. And so it's neutral on the surface, but in the end, it's going to clearly favor one side over another. And the cash and carry act that was passed through in 1939, the United States is going to end an arms embargo with Great Britain, and is going to openly trade weapons to them, give them weapons. Selective Service Act was passed through in 1940. The United States started drafting soldiers into the military by 1940. Hey, remember during World War I, the U.S., we entered into the war, but it took us a while to add in reinforcements to the AEF that we sent in because we had to really get troops prepared to fight. Here, we had started training soldiers more than a year before Pearl Harbor was ever attacked. So the Selective Service Act was passed through in 1940. Destroyers for bases in 1940. Great Britain gets 50 old American ships to combat and fight against Germany in the Atlantic. In return, the United States is given the ability to build military bases on British islands in the Caribbean. So it's clear that although we're not involved in the war yet, we're aware that we're probably going to be involved in the war, at least from FDR's side, in terms of it shows that we're preparing for it. Now, in 1940, President Roosevelt is drafted for a third term as president. Remember, this is going to be a break of tradition. We had never had a president run for a third term before, and so this was new. It was he runs for election, and he says something very Wilsonian, when he says, "Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars." I think he knew that not to be true, but he said it anyway because he wanted to get reelected, and it rings similar to what Wilson said when he was running for re-election in 1916, when Wilson said he kept us out of war, knowing that we were going to get involved in war. It was only months after the election for Wilson. It was about a year after the election of FDR that we would be drawn into these world wars. They knew what was going on, but the American voter still wasn't fully on board with getting involved in this war. So if he were to campaign on "we're going to war," he would have lost. His opponent in that race was Wendell Willkie, who was not going to end the New Deal because that was so extremely popular. He just wanted to make it better and maybe slightly different, some slight changes, but he wasn't going to scrap it altogether. Nobody really in the United States, it wouldn't have been very popular to go back to the old 1920s style of federal government staying out of people's lives, because people saw the value of having basically an insurance policy behind unemployment and poverty. So Wendell Willkie was likable, and he was criticizing FDR. This is really the big thing that Wendell Willkie did, was he criticized the idea that FDR was running for a third term as president. That was, a lot of people looked at that in kind of a suspicious way. You see these dictators rising up in Europe and Asia, and also suddenly we have a president that wants to be president for more than 2 terms. It seems a little bit suspicious, but it wasn't suspicious enough for the American people who were going to vote for FDR out of office. Willkie did better than the previous opponents, Hoover and Landon, to FDR, but still lost by a considerable margin. So FDR is serving his 3rd term as president. And at a speech in January of 1941, after his election, he addresses Congress and he says that he's promising 4 freedoms. So FDR's 4 freedoms were freedom of speech, freedom to worship, so First Amendment stuff there, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And so freedom from want and freedom from fear could be kind of traced to the preamble of the Constitution and the general welfare clause of the Constitution. But you could look at the freedom from fear aspect as being able to build up the military enough in order to essentially be able to defend ourselves if we had to. So maybe he's kind of putting that out there. And it goes a little bit further from there. You can see this kind of rapidly builds up in 1940, where we're quickly preparing for war, knowing that something's going to happen. And in a December 1940 fireside chat, FDR coins the term arsenal of democracy. To me, that sounds a lot like Wilsonian's or President Wilson's idea of peace and democracy for the world. And he coins this term in 1940, and he's going to kind of start to enact policy that's going to prepare the United States for war and prepare the American public for war if necessary. And so the Lend-Lease Act was passed in 1941, which gave weapons to Great Britain on credit, so they didn't have to pay us back initially. We were full out backing the British in this war. We were clearly not neutral, even though the United States was not officially involved in the war at that point. And further on in 1941, in the summer of 1941, President Roosevelt meets with Winston Churchill on the ship in the Atlantic Ocean, and the Atlantic Charter is agreed to, where both sides agree to not seek territorial gain. Britain promises not to do that. This is a blueprint. This Atlantic Charter is also a blueprint to the United Nations, where countries would come together and try to come up with some agreements to further the cause of world peace. And in this case, it's going to be to stop the rise of dictatorships that are springing about. So this is a secret meeting that is akin or similar to an alliance, or at least it's the forming of an alliance. On December 7th of 1941, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. Our Pacific Fleet is located there. The United States had passed through embargoes on Japan after their attacks on China, and they were running out of steel, they were running out of oil, and it was kind of a last-ditch effort, I suppose, by Japan to try to force us to give over some of those things or to trade with them again. It had the opposite effect. The very next day, President Roosevelt asks and receives a declaration of war from Congress. So he declared war on Japan on December 8th, 1941, day after Pearl Harbor. Germany and Italy would declare war on the United States. The United States would then declare war on them. We are now involved in a world war. By June of 1942, the Germans, they negate their previous agreement, the Molotov Agreement with the Soviet Union. They invade the Soviet Union. And so the Soviet Union now joins the Allies because of necessity, not because of an ideological similarity. They were very different than the rest of the powerful Allies. But the United States, when they entered this war, focused more on Europe and They figured that they needed to win there first to shore up their allies, and then focus in on Japan. Now, they'd still be fighting a two-front war, but it was more of where are they going to try to send most of the resources first, since you're fighting in two different places. World War II created the best economy the United States has ever seen. GDP increased by 4.5 times. During this war, unemployment was down to 1.2%, which basically means we had no unemployment. If you didn't have a job during World War II, either you didn't want a job or you couldn't work for some other reason. So that's essentially a 1.2% unemployment rate is zero unemployment. Farm prices double. My goodness, farmers are doing well. That's the first time that had happened since the early 1900s. Land values increase. That also improves farmers' situations because they own a lot of land. Union membership increases by 1/3. So we had been around 10 million before we entered into the war, about 15 million by the end of the war. Remember, we were only at 1 million in 1930, so union membership continues to explode. A lot more people are able to get jobs that would have unions available to them. So that's why it spikes there. People start, this is an amazing thing. I don't know. This is kind of it's a kind of a unheard of concept this time. During the war, people saved money. Americans saved money. That was the opposite of the 1920s. This is going to be great because when the war is over, there's going to be money available for people to buy things. That's going to lead to an increased consumer culture in the 1950s, eventually, since people were saving money at that time. And the beauty of World War II, which is kind of different than World War I in some ways, is that it seemed like there was a clear good versus bad. And the good guys, the United States, France, who had already been taken over by this point, and Britain. And we would use propaganda to soften the image of Joseph Stalin to try to make him seem less evil at the time. And he was very evil, killed a lot of people in the Soviet Union during his reign there. But we would at least make it seem like we were the good guys going against these tyrannical leaders, these dictators of the Axis powers, where in Germany, clearly the bad guys, as we learned from the Holocaust, the Japanese, mass murdered Chinese, and these were civilians, and there was propaganda about rape as true propaganda. So maybe it's not propaganda, it's just news that took place by Japanese soldiers on Chinese civilians. So in the Italians gassing Ethiopians, there were a lot of bad things that these tyrants were up to in the Axis powers, and it made it more palatable to the American people that we were on this side and we were involved in this war, especially when all the information about all that stuff got out eventually. Wasn't necessarily all out. We didn't enter into the war necessarily knowing about the Holocaust, but when it was all over and the news was there and people could read about it, maybe the end result then was we would not retreat into isolationism again because we did a good thing when this war was over by defeating people like Hitler and Mussolini and Tojo. That's the end of Lecture 2. We have one more to go.